Okay, let's take a look at what's going on here. And what we're doing here, when we click on this create activity, we're moving to a different route, but nothing's changing inside our component. Now, we're not changing the component here. It's exactly the same component that we already have loaded inside our browser here. And if we go and click on inspect and go and take a look at our components, and we go and take a look at the activity form, then some of the information here we don't get to see easily because it's coming from MobX, and this observer kind of doesn't really give us a clear picture of what's going on with this itself. But what we're doing here is we're not doing anything to change the observer in this case. And what I mean by that is if I click on create activity, keep an eye on the props inside here. These are coming from our router where we've got the history, the location and the match. And in the location specifically, we'll certainly see some changes there. And if I click on create activity, then we can see that the path name changed, the key has changed here, but what we don't see is anything taking place in MobX. And why is that? Well, if we go and take a look at our activity form, then we specifically said in our use effect that we only want this to execute if the ID parameter changes or the load activity changes. Now the ID parameter is changing, and if we go back and take a look at this, then inside the match and the params, we go from having an ID to not having an ID. And if I go back, then we can see that the ID is set in this case, and if we go and create an activity, then the ID disappears. So why is this not doing anything? Well, if we go and take a look at the React component documentation, I'm going to refer back to how React used to be just for a moment. And when we used React with class components, we would have access to state and lifecycle methods. Now, we don't have access to these inside a React functional component, the types of components that we're creating in this application. But what we do have, if we go and take a look at the component lifecycle, this is how it was when we used to use classes. We would have access to things like a constructor and a render method and different lifecycle methods, what to do after certain events occur when the component is first mounted and when the component will mount. Some of these methods are marked as unsafe as they're being removed in the next version of React. And also we have one here that says unsafe component will receive props. And what we used to do in React class components is we'd check to see the props that we are receiving inside a component, and then we could take an action based on whether the prop has changed in some way. And that's how we would used to deal with something like this. When our props change, we could say, aha, we've no longer got an ID, so go and clear the fields inside here, and that would be how we would handle this kind of situation. But we can't do that because we're not using a class component. If we were, we wouldn't want to use this method because it's now considered unsafe and is deprecated and will be removed in a future version of React. But what we do have is options. And the option that we'll take a look at is based on the guideline. If we used component will receive props to reset some state when a prop changes, consider either making a component fully controlled or fully uncontrolled with a key instead. Now what we can use here, if I go and take a look at the fully uncontrolled component with a key, then what this is suggesting to us is that we give our component a key property. And when the key changes, React will create a new component instance rather than update the current one. Now we use keys when we're using dynamic lists, but they're also useful in this case. And if we instantiate a new component to replace this one, then what we're going to do is call our useEffect method once again, and we're going to set our state once again to the empty activity. And in the other case where we have the ID, we're going to call our useEffect. So by giving this property or this component a key, then we're going to force our component to reset its state, in other words. And what we can use for that is we can use the location as part of the props that we get from React Router, because this comes with a key. And if I go back, then we'll see that the key changes each time whenever I move from creating an activity or going back to a previous activity. So we can use this as our property. And also with React Router, one of the hooks that we get is the use location hook. And this will give us access to that key. So let's head back to VS Code and we'll go to our app component here, because where we're going to place this key is in the root component that's responsible for loading the activity form. So just inside our function here, we'll say const location equals, and then we'll say use location. And we get this from React Router, of course. And then we can say in our root here, we can give it a key, and we can set this equal to location.key. Now, if we take a look at what happens now when we go back to our application, and let's just repeat the behavior. And if I go back to the activities, click on an activity, edit the activity, and we've got our activity in our browser, and then create an activity. Now we do clear the activity here. And if we go back to the activities, and we can create an activity, it's all fine. And we've still got some cleanup to do. None of these buttons are working. And if I click on activities, well, we don't see a flicker there, but if I click on view and then click on create activities, we see a flicker. So we've still got some things to address. And what we'll take a look at in the next lesson is how after we've created or edited an activity, we can move the user to a different location after submission. And we'll take a look at that next.